Apologies for the delay. Good morning, everyone. Nice to be back in action. Okay, so we were talking about the Gemara at the top of Chof Gimel Amud Aleph, in which the Gemara says that the Gemara asks on Rabbi Yehuda from Meducha shel Shum, and the diuk of the Gemara is from the Abai really asks Abai asks on Rabbah from Meducha shel Shum, and the diuk from the Gemara is from the second din, which is imlav ein metalton and osa, but we're focusing on the first part of the memra. So basically, the Gemara says that a Meducha shel Shum, which is seemingly a klish melachot l'isa, is Muktza against Rabbah's understanding that it's mutter l'sorach l'komo. And the Gemara says that's the question of the Gemara, and the Gemara also mentions that if it actually has the Shum inside it, then it would be mutter l'taltel. So this Gemara is a very, very important maramokum for Muktza, a kli shemelachta l'isa, a kli which is Muktza because it's used for a melacha, whether having a non-Muktza item inside it helps and how that mechanism works. So that's what we're focusing on now. So even though it's incidental in the Gemara, in other words, the Gemara really is asking from the Sefer, which says that kli shemelachta l'isa is asur l'taltel, but incidentally in that memory you see from the Gemara that a kli shemelachta l'isa, which has Shum inside it, is mutter l'taltel, and the question is, why is it mutter l'taltel? So we began working through the Rishonim last time, and I just really want to finish our job of just looking through the Rishonim. So the Rashba understood, the Rashba, really we looked at the Rashba for two things. The Rashba brought a Yesh Pirish, who said one Peshat, and the Rashba said his own Peshat. The Yesh Pirish we labeled as the Rosh, and all the Rishonim bring this Yesh Pirish, and this Yesh Pirish says, is of the belief that any kli shemelachta la'isa, if you put on it something non-mukta, that removes its mukta status somehow or other, in some respects. And this is really based on the Gemara. I'm just going to mute everyone because I'm getting a bit of interference. Sorry. Muted myself. Mute all. Okay, sorry. So this is based on the Gemara, which says that you can put a kikar or tinuk, you can put a loaf of bread or a child on the mace, and the Gemara in Kuf Mem Beis on the base says that this heter is only a heter with mace, and most Rishonim take that to mean that there's a unique heter with a dead body because of Adam Bohol, because a person's in a time of confusion and distress, that when they experience a bereavement, or because of Kovet Avriyas. So with a dead body, it helps to put a non-mukta item on top, and that allows you to move it. But with everything else, not. This is the view of most Rishonim. The Rosh understood that the Gemara is saying only with a mace, which isn't a kedi at all, there the solution of kicker doesn't help. But with anything which is a kedi, the solution of putting a non-mukta item on top of it helps. Okay, so just to summarize that we're crystal clear on this, there is a Gemara in Daf Mem Gimel Amud Aleph that says that when you have a dead body, which is Muktza, and the dead body needs to be moved out of the sun, you can put a non-Muktza item on it, and somehow that allows you to move the corpse. What would be the basis of the allowance to move the corpse? Somehow your action relates to the non-mukta item, the loaf of bread or the child that's placed on top of the corpse, and therefore this is considered an action in the non-mukta item, and the corpse becomes a mere holder of the mukta item, of the non-mukta item, and therefore it's permitted. That's what the Gemara says in Mem Gimel. The Rosh understands the same principle as at work over here. The Meducha, the garlic press, is mukta. However, since it has Shum inside, my action relates to the Shum, not to the garlic press. In other words, if we look at what am I doing, I'm moving this utensil in order to get the Shum to wherever I need the Shum to be. So I need to sprinkle garlic on my chicken soup, and it happens to be inside a press. So I'm allowed to move the press in order to move the garlic from A to B. So my action is an action in the Shum, not an action in the mukta item. That's how the Rosh understands the Gemara. Ask the Rishonim, but the Gemara says that we only apply this heter in exceptional circumstances, in the emergency scenario of the mace. Answers the Rosh, that's because in the case of the mace is a Muktza machmas kufra. It's not a kedi at all. It's just a lump of matter. It's not something that serves human needs at all. So in that case, the logic of saying it serves as a carrying vehicle for the non-muktzah item doesn't make sense. and therefore we only allow that because of the emergency situation of a mace. But in a case where you have a keli, the garlic press is a keli, all kelims are made for human use. That's the basis of Rabba's Hatter, who says that you're allowed to move something, a keli, so it's good for the Sochem Koma, even though it's Muktza. A Klisha Menachta Issa, you can't move for the Muktza use, but if you're moving it for the non-Muktza use, Rabba holds you can move it because it's a keli. The Gemara here is arguing on Rabba's view. Abba is arguing on Rabba's view. He said, we don't go, that's too far. You can't say that you can move every non-Muktza keli for every Muktza keli for a non-Muktza use. But if it actually has a non-Muktza item on it, there everyone would agree that that would be allowed. This is the Rosh's logic. So the logic of the Rosh is that we have in our Gemara a source for an enormously practical halachic idea, which is whenever you have a Muktza keli, as long as it's a keli, it's not like a dead body, it's not like a stone, which isn't a keli at all. But something which is a keli, if you put something non-Muktza on it, you can move it because the action relates to the non-Muktza item, not to the Muktza item. And this is the logic of our Gemara. So goes the view of the Yesh Mishonim that's cited in all the Rishonim. And as we said, this is the view of the Rosh.
Is it clear where you can put the non-Muktza item on it and change on the kli and change status during Shabbos?
We'll come to that in a moment. Very, very good, China. Excellent, China.
Yeah, can I maybe ask you?
Yeah.
In the Met business, it seems, or maybe it isn't, that it's clear it's only Tinoch and a Kikar. So does it have to be something with a certain chashivut, or anything?
It has to have a certain chashivut, but you see from Shum that it doesn't have to be a fantastic chashivut. It has to be something that's useful, that has a that's not Muktza, something that has a usefulness. Yeah.
But it was noticeable on Men Gimel and Aleph. It was Kiko and Tinoch, not.
The Rishonim understand that that's just an example of something practical rather than being. You could maybe sprinkle some grains of salt or something on the mace or something trivial. But if it be something, whether it be appropriate, I don't know. If you put Shum on the mace, then that would also be
You could have said Kiko, Tinoch, or Sefer.
Yeah, but that would be the same. The Rishonim understand that's Lav Dafka. Don't forget, a book is a very modern example of something cheap and easy to move. In the times of Gemara, a book was an exceptionally rare and expensive artifact, handwritten by scribes. So examples differ. Yeah.
I would say the question is emphasised by the fact that the Rambam is saying if you don't, in the case where you can't find a Tinoch or a Kikar,
yes,
there are many other sort of really non-Muktza items
yes,
which you could put on there. So maybe that emphasises their question.
It would have to be something that's non-trivial. And that that is used for Shabbos. But beyond that, I'm not aware of the poskim setting. I'm not aware of like a defined limit that I'm aware of. Yeah. Okay, so this is the view of the Rosh. So just to summarize, first, sorry, Gary.
The primary purpose is the film. We can't use it as a coins that someone wants to move the mortar. Oh, let's put some Shum and then
the Rosh, it's a good question how far the Rosh would go, but in principle, the Hatter of the Rosh is a comparison to the Gemara on Mem Gimel, and he says that a Kikar Tinoch helps with any Kedushin Machal Issa. So you could use it as it's a solution to Muktza problems on Shabbos. According to the Rosh, put Kikar on top of it, and then it becomes a tray rather to move the non-Muktza rather than an action relating to the Muktza item. With the body, it's a chap. Yes, that's what the Gemara says in Kuf Mem Beis Amud Beis. That with the body, the Heter doesn't really make sense because it's a body. It's not a keli. Nonetheless, because of the needs of caring for the dead body or the confusion and stress of the Avelim, we're makel. But with a keli, the Rosh doesn't think it's a kunst. It's not a chap. It's not a trick. It's the logic of kelim is that kelim are there to serve needs. Even though we don't go as far as Rabban and say you can move a kli for any need, but if it's actually got a non-mux item on it, everyone would agree. Says the Rosh that it's allowed. So it's a heter or a somewhat of a stretch in the case of mace as an allowance because of the awful situation of the dead body. The application to bosses is a little easier because in the case of bosses, you've got, let's say, a tray that isn't fundamentally muktzah, it's just a tray. It happens to be on the tray is sitting muktzah. You've left your car keys on the tray. So there, if you put a loaf of bread on top of the tray, then what makes the tray more of a bosses for the car keys than it is for the loaf? So there it's an easier allowance. The chiddush here is it's not a tray, it's a Meducha, it's a Muktza item, and nonetheless it would be mutter, because even with a Muktza item, you can view it as a tray for the non-Muktza item, and your action relates to the non-Muktza item rather than to the Muktza item. That's the Rosh's view. Rav shouldn't argue on it. They say this doesn't make sense. The Gemara tells us in Kufmen Beis that this is a special allowance in the desperate circumstances of a bereavement, and it's not a general allowance in other kelim. How can you force the logic? If you're moving a Muktza item and a non-Muktza item sitting on top of it, you're doing two actions. You're moving a Meducha and you're moving a Shum. Why should your action relate more to one than the other? So that's okay. So this is the view of the Rosh. The Rashba says a different logic, and we spent some time, I think, in the last year, which I don't think I gave live, I only gave online. The Rashba says a different logic, and the Rashba says that the way we came to a conclusion of reading the Rashba is that the Rashba is saying that effectively it becomes like a klisha melachot leheta. In other words, again, let's contrast this to the earlier opinion of Rabba. Rabba says a kli is made for any use. Therefore, even a klisha melachot le'isa, a hammer, if you're going to use it for a mutter use, like cracking a coconut, that would be mutter. That's Rabba's logic. Abai argues on it. He's asking from this memory which seems to contradict it. And he says, no, it's not true. But I agree, if I'm actually using it for the mutter use, for which this keli is also made, there it would cease to be mukta. And the analogy they use is of a pot that you cook things in. So a pot that you cook things in is a klisha melachot le'isa, because cooking's also on Shabbos. But pots are also used to serve things. You boil the potatoes in the pot, but then you serve the potatoes from the pot. So when you're serving the potatoes from the pot is even though it's a klisha melachot le'isa, there everyone would agree that it's serving a heta functionality, a heta function of the pot. There it should be allowed. And as the whole reason it's klisha melachot le'isa is because of its role as a garlic press, because of its role as a pot to cook in. But here I'm using it for the subsidiary but equally intrinsic function of the pot, to use it as a vehicle for holding the potatoes, the Meducha for holding the Shum, and therefore with respect to that it would be allowed. Let me maybe just step back just to avoid confusion over here. We have kelim which are klisha melachot le'isa, a hammer. A hammer is there to bang nails into walls. According to the Halacha, and this is Rabbi's opinion that Rabbi argues with, I can, on occasion, if I happen to choose to use the hammer to crack a coconut, there would also be a mutter use. But the hammer is fundamentally mukta because it's only made for nail hammering, which is a melacha. But since there's a keli, it's only made for any use, and therefore I can use it for cracking coconut. Then you have kelim which are a keli shemalachta leheta ula issa. They're used equally for both. They're just neutral. They're used for both options. That would be a different category. Over here, the Rosh was not arguing that a pot or a meducha is a keli shemalachta le'isa leheta. Clearly, the primary use of a pot is cooking. The primary use of a press is garlic pressing. You don't normally store garlic in garlic presses long term. You don't normally serve potatoes from the pot with which they're boiled. So it's primarily a klisha melachta le'isa. That's why you put it in the pot. If you just wanted to serve it, you'd put it in a nicer pot. The only reason you're serving it from the pot in which it's been boiled is because that's where you boiled it. So it's fundamentally klisha melachta le'isa. Nonetheless, the logic of the Rosh is that if I'm using it for the actual act of serving the potatoes, the actual act of serving the Shum, of containing the Shum and moving the Shum around, in that case it wouldn't be mutter. Also, with respect to that, it becomes like a kli shemalachto leheta. So goes the svara of the Rosh.
Would it make a difference if you serve meat on someone's plate, and therefore you're using it manifestly as something that is edible, or if you then transferred it via something else?
Either way, whilst the pot contains the potatoes, I'm using it as a klisha melachta leheta. That's the Rashba's logic. It's very normal. People boil potatoes in pots and serve the potatoes straight from the pot. The reason it's a subservient use, not the main use, is because you're only serving it from the pot because you cooked it in the pot. So if you wanted to serve potatoes just by themselves, you wouldn't choose a pot. The primary function of a pot, the reason you're using a clunky metal thing to serve potatoes is because that's where you cooked it. So it's primarily a klisha melachta le'isa, but it happens to be at the moment I'm using it as klisha melachta leheta, and there everyone would agree. That's the logic of the Rashba. By the way, it's occurred to me that there is the Rosh, by the way, on the surface looks like an outstanding color, and the Rashba is the narrower leniency, right? The Rosh holds that any klisha melachta leheta, you can put a non-muktzah item on it and it would be mutter. Sorry, any klisha melachta le'isa, you can put a non-muktzah item on it and you would be allowed to move it. The Rashba doesn't know only where it's part of the functionality of this utensil, where it's like a secondary function of the utensil. It occurred to me there would be a color in the svara of the Rosh, which gets back to let's not forget our what perek we're learning, which is we're learning that the perek of kol hakelim, dalsos kelim, lids and doors of kelim. So what about the lid of the pot? So according to the Rosh, I think the lid of the pot would be Muktza, because the potatoes are resting in the pot. The Shum is resting in the Meducha. They're not resting on the lid. The pot is the tray. The Meducha is the tray. The lid isn't the tray. The lid is the lid. I don't think here it would make sense. The reason why a lid isn't Muktza when a pot, if you have a keli with a lid, the reason the lid isn't Muktza is because the keli is not Muktza, and the lid is part of the functionality of the keli. Correct? The whole logic of the Rosh is that I'm not moving the pot as a pot. I'm moving it just as a means to move the non-Muktza item. So why would the lid be subservient to it in that case?
Well, it could be. It's a practical matter. It could be if you've got in the oven, you've got a pot with a lid. Right? You can't take the pot out of the oven unless you take the lid out of it. The lid is there.
Unless the lid is off. I'm not sure subsumed makes sense in this case. What I was, believe it or not, I was actually doing chazorah in the beginning of the perek. It got me thinking about lids again. Correct, but let's think through the logic again. This is why I want to bring out this point. I knew this would be somewhat controversial when I said this, right? There's a really important point of concept. Sorry, yeah. Correct. No, I don't think so, according to the Rosh. Again, the Rosh's logic is that any Muktza item, any cliche, let's start from the beginning. The reason why lids or doors can be moved with a keli is because it's part of one functionality. That's however exactly we cut up. We spent a lot of time in the beginning exactly analysing the lomdas of it, but it all gets down to a basic svara, which is Rashi's language of machmas avien. It gets down basically to the svara that a cupboard has a door to it, a pot has a lid to it. It's part of one functionality. Great. What functionality is it part of? Part of being a pot, potness functionality, right? So pots have lids. The logic of the Rosh, let's keep the Rosh and the Rashba separate in our minds. Let's really try and just focus very narrowly on each of their svaras. The Rosh says that you can move a Muktza item when it has a non-Muktza thing sitting on top of it, because my action is only relating to the non-Muktza item, not to the Muktza item. The Muktza item just becomes a pair of tongs or a tray to hold the non-Muktza item. What I'm really moving is the non-Muktza item. With respect to that movement, the lid is irrelevant. I may be interested in keeping the potatoes hot, but who cares about what I'm interested in? The allowance to move the pot is because I'm not moving the pot, I'm moving the potatoes in the pot just as the means of moving the potatoes. So with respect to the pot, I don't think a lid would make sense. I don't think there'd be a heta of a lid in this case. The Rosh was looking at functionality. The Rosh was saying, normally a pot is Muktza because it's used for cooking potatoes. But in this case, I'm using the pot to serve potatoes. That's part of the functionality of the pot. So to the degree that's part of the functionality of the pot, the lid is also part of that functionality. I'm using the pot as a pot to serve potatoes. So the lid is also part of that. In the Rosh's svara, the whole point is I'm not using it as a pot. I'm just using it as a means to move a non-Muktza item. To the degree that I focus on the pot, I can't move it because the pot is Muktza. The whole logic is that I'm moving it as a means to move the non-Muktza. So in that case, I don't think the logic of lids or doorways will make sense. I think it's a very important horror. Jeffrey, you're looking pained. I don't set out to cause anyone distress. That's not the purpose of this show. Fine, okay, that's a healthy pain. Exercise, working out pain. Okay, yeah.
Change the functionality of pot, which is the Yesh, but it is surely lid, which is sort of very not so sort of Yesh after this. Surely that can also.
The only if I use the lid to carry something, yeah, I could put on the lid an apple and move the lid also. But if I put an apple on the pot, that's got nothing to do with the lid. The whole logic of the Rosh is that I'm moving the apple, I'm not moving the pot. The pot, that my action isn't relevant to the pot. It's a means to move an apple. The lid doesn't enhance or enable me to move it. Maybe it's a liquid that's swishing over the surface. Then the lid is necessary to keep the liquid in. Maybe then you could argue it's necessary. But you have to ask yourself one raw question according to the Rosh, which is, am I moving this keli just as a means to move the non-Muktza, just as a means to move the apple? If the answer is yes, I can move it. If not, not. The lid isn't necessary to move the apple. Whereas in the Rashba, we're in the world of functionality. What's the function of this pot? Normally for cooking, but in this case, it's being used to serve food, so that it shouldn't be Muktza. The Rosh never told us anything about keeping warm is a very nice thing to do, but it's a type of bosses type sorrow here. It's where the Muktza is sitting, right? The non-Muktza is sitting.
The Rosh would have to explain the Mishnah in a specific way, because it's still the Mishnah says
Correct. So the Rosh would say, in this case over here, so the Mishnah says any non-Muktza kedi you can move the delet with. Over here it says a Muktza kedi, so you can't move the delet with. Why am I allowed to move it? Because there are rare cases where you can move Muktza kedim because something's sitting on top of it. It's not a kedi hanittel. It's not a non-Muktza kedi. The pot. This is really the point I'm trying to bring out. According to the Rashba, the pot becomes momentarily non-Mukta. According to the Rosh, the pot is Mukta. It's just I can move Mukta items when something non-Mukta is sitting on top of it. Why should that help the lid? So if you want to really drill down to the mathematical sort of statement, the Mishnah says, Kol ha-kelim anitolim talus l'seim amayim. You can move lids with kelim anitolim. According to the Rashba, momentarily the pot becomes a keli anitol. According to the Rosh, it's not a keli anitol, it's a muktzah keli. Just happens to be that.
The alternative would be to have to take the lid off, which goes to a family muktzah, isn't it?
So that's a good point. It may be if you've got the lid on, it's a problem. Or it's called the Tzorech Gufa, and therefore you could just take it off to move it down. Sorry, Tzorech Makomo, so you could just move it out of the way or something like that. Yeah, and I think it's an important. Sorry, so there was some hands up in it. Yeah.
I mean, if you don't take yourself a common thing, then you end up in a very difficult situation for the Rosh. If you've got the lid on top of the pot, so you're only allowed to move the pot because the contents inside it, but you can't get to the contents because it's not outside. You can't move the lid because there's no reason.
Yeah. So Halacha would be so again in Rabba's worldview, we paskin the Tzorech Makomo is mutter. So you're moving the lid to Tzorech Makomo to get access to something. In Abaya's worldview, where the only heter is when you're actually using it, because with the svara of Shum or Meducha and of Lami, so life would be tough.
The pot's kind of like covered in insulation, buried, so allowed to move the lid off that.
You know why? Because sorry, in that case there's two cases. One case is because of Tzorech Gufa, Tzorech Makomo. The other case that we're talking about is where there's dirt on the radish and you're pulling out the radish because
On the pot, you're allowed to move the Muktza item off the lid to access the side.
because the only heter would be Tzorech Makomo and Achnami. But if we go into, and that works for Halacha because we pass in like Rabba that you can move to Tzorech Makomo. If we go into Abaya's worldview, at least in his question, he doesn't know of the heter of Tzorech Makomo. He only knows of Shum and Meducha.
Are we doing a share from Shum going to cover 10, which is the Halacha of the Master?
Are we going to reach, sorry, to cover?
Number 10, which is the Master.
Whether we'll do it this year or not, I can't imagine we'll get there in the next 6 minutes. Yeah, we will. Yeah, we'll take this after the Master. Yeah. This I can't stress enough. This is even though this is like 4 words in the Gemara, it's an exceptionally important Gemara Halacha Maisa. So we definitely will take it Halacha Maisa. Yeah, we will get to practice on Halacha. Yeah.
Are you not changing this process of serving?
No, I don't. No. According to the Rashba, you're doing that. You're changing it into a Klisha Melachot Heter. According to the Rosh, it's nothing to do with changing the pot. It's just your action relates to the non-Muktza item, not to the Muktza item. And let's not think about pots because let's go to a more extreme case where the Rosh extends it, right? So you have a I don't know, you have a maybe a wallet or maybe wallet's not so good, but it's something that's completely incidental to what's on it. You have a hammer, right? You have a saw, and on top of the saw you put an apple in order to allow you to move the saw. That's the Rosh's chiddush, but you can do that. So it's a wild chiddush, right? I mean, it's very counterintuitive. None of the Rishonim like this. They say it's a heter with mace. The Gemara made a special heter with mace because of the emergency situation. I hear the problem in pot is we're all slipping into the Rashba Svara of saying, but I'm using the pot as a serving pot. That's not the Rashba Svara. The Rosh Svara. The Rosh Svara is even when they're completely unrelated. I put an apple on top of a saw. So my action relates to the apple, not to the saw, and therefore it's mutter. And the Rishonim don't like this chiddush. Yeah.
This applies to the idea of a keyring as one in which it's just they're not detached. It's not one supporting.
Yeah, the difference there is that they're always attached, and it's just the way I have the bunch, and also that's in our world in which Tzorech Gufa the Tzorech Makomo is mutter. So I'm forced to move the Muktza, the car key, because it's attached on a ring with my house key, and my house key is a Klisha Melachot Heter, and my car key is a Klisha Melachot Issa. So I'm moving it to Tzorech Makomo again, or something like that. So why can I move the whole key ring? Because I can't move my house key without also moving the car key. Yeah. Okay. So that's the view of the Rosh and the Rashba. I'll just address briefly Edward's question because it is a very important question to ask. which is this only? And I think someone else also asked this last time. Is this only when are we talking about putting the non-Muktza item onto the onto the basket? Are we talking about on Shabbos, or even only before Shabbos, or even on Shabbos? So the truth is, this isn't really a machlokus or question in our sugya. It's a much broader question, which I'll mention now, but we won't go into too much detail about. Which is, there is basically, let's rephrase the question. A clear, I have a KD which is Muktza on Erev Shabbos when Shabbos comes in, and I want to detoxify it on Shabbos by putting food on top of it, Shum on top of it, or something like that. So does that work on Shabbos or not? Okay, why shouldn't it work on Shabbos? Why not? I mean, I've put something on top of it, why shouldn't it work? Well, the answer is, I would think it wouldn't work, because we know that the whole logic of Muktza is that the way it's when Shabbos comes in, you can't create new functionalities. If it's a KD, it has functionality. If it's not a KD, it doesn't have functionality. That's the logic of Migudis Katzoi, Ben Hashmashas. So really the question we're asking over here is the logic of Migudis Katzoi only with something which isn't a KD at all, like a stone? Or is it even with something which is a kli shemelachto le'issa? Or to put this differently, till we learn Hilchos Muktza, again, I keep on saying this point, we think something is Muktza or isn't Muktza. That's what we're used to talking about, right? Your kids will ask you, is this Muktza, isn't this Muktza? You're on Shabbos, you'll worry, is this Muktza? And that's what we think about. We've discovered that's not correct. That's not the way to think about it. We need to think about Muktza with respect to functionalities. Most things that we think of as Muktza are not really completely Muktza. Pens and phones and keys and all these things are kli shemelachto le'issa. That means to say their main functionality is a forbidden one, therefore their default setting is Muktza. But they're a keli. A keli is omed for any functionality, and therefore if I wish to use it for a Muktza functionality, I can do so. That's the head of using this hammer, not just for knocking. I can't use the hammer for knocking nails in, and the hammer is Muktza because it's omed for non-use. It doesn't have functionality. But if I decide to use it for coconut bashing, I can, because it's a keli. It's omed for any tashmish. So does the logic of Migudis Katzoi make sense with a kli shemelachto le'issa? You could say, yeah, it's Muktza before Shabbos, it's Muktza on Shabbos. Or you could say, no, the whole logic of kli shemelachto le'issa is that it's a keli shemelachto le'issa. It's only for any ishtamshus. So it's true that on the start of Shabbos, it was Muktza because it was a hammer, which was there for just nailing. But on Shabbos, I want to use it for a coconut. So therefore, it's not Muktza with respect to that. So similarly, why should it become not Muktza? Why shouldn't it be able to become not Muktza if I put an apple on top of it and rest the food item on it, and I want to move the food item on it? Okay, let me try and phrase the same shayla in another form. If you have something which smashes on Shabbos and the shards are usable, not for the original use, which was as a vase, but for a new use as a piece of clay or something like that. We saw this again, by the way, in Tosfos, right at the beginning of the Masechet. So if it's not Muktza, the answer is before Shabbos it was a keli. A keli was only made for any ishtamshus, and therefore, tragically, the keli has broken. But now it's got a new ishtamshus as shards, and therefore it should be allowed. What happens if a kli shemelachto le'issa breaks on Shabbos, such that it now has non-Muktza use? So my hammer smashed. I no longer can use it as a hammer because a hammer with a handle and the metal bit separated is unusable as a hammer, but the metal bit now is usable as a door stopper or a paperweight, right? So is it omed now? Does it cease to be Muktza and it's omed now for ishtamshus? What would be the logic that it would cease to be Muktza? It was Muktza at the beginning of Shabbos. How can it cease to be Muktza on Shabbos? The answer is it's a keli. Kelim are omed for all potential uses. It's now broken, and therefore it's omed for its broken use as a non-Muktza artifact. So that's the shayla really that Edward you were asking. That's really the question over here, which is does the logic of Migudis Katzoi ben Hashmashas that at the start of Shabbos it was Muktza make sense with the klisha melachto le'issa? And the answer is I have no idea. I don't know. It's machlokus. It remains a significant machlokus between significant poskim. It's an unresolved question in Halacha. There's an Eli Rabbah, and there's a Mishnah Berurah, and there's a Pri Megadim, and it remains one of the big conceptual questions in Hilchos Shabbos. And then the Muktza is a drabonim, and therefore certainly in the case of needs, one could be makel like the very senior poskim who allow it, but the very senior poskim who don't allow it. It's an interesting question to ponder how whether the logic of Migudis Katzoi makes sense on in the kli shemelachto le'issa. Okay, so we'll stop here today, and Mr. Shum carry on.